I'm with Adam Fleischer, and we're going to be talking about some items coming up in his auction. When is the date for your auction coming up?
It's scheduled right now for May 28th, so that's a Saturday. But we're currently cooking up the catalog and experiencing some slight delays, so it might be the week after or even the week after that. But as of right now, it's set for May 28th.
And we're going to be seeing plenty of Civil War artifacts on there, right?
Yes, I think right now we're up to 250 lots, and I think that there may be as many as about 350. So it's going to be a fairly sizable sale.
Fantastic. Well, I wanted to bring you on here. We've had you on before to just talk about how you got into Civil War relic dealing, but let's talk about some of the items you're actually handling, especially coming up in this coming auction. So, do you have any you can share with us prior to this auction?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I've sort of selected 5 or 6 items that I'm most excited about in this sale. And I guess I'll start in no particular order with this original signed carte de visite of General Robert E. Lee. And the general was fairly generous in signing items, especially after the war. And as you can imagine, every patriotic Southerner was interested in having an autograph of General Lee's. And so I think I'll send you a scan so that you can kind of broadcast a high quality version next to me. But that one is going to be particularly valuable because he's wearing an actual uniform in the photo itself. And I don't have access to the photographer's imprint on the reverse, but I do believe that that was taken or at least produced in Richmond, Virginia. And as you can see, the signature is just absolutely flawless. And so there are a variety of different aspects of those that dictate value. And the most important is probably condition. And also, there are a variety of different poses that he was taken in. And so this one should go for a hefty sum in the sale.
Do we know like the starting bids yet for these items or no?
I think the estimate for that item will probably be 25 to 3,500 or in that neighborhood. It's actually interesting that you asked the question because forever those were worth maybe 15 to $2,500 retail, maybe a little bit more than that. But lately, they've just really taken off. The last 4 or 5 that have come available publicly at auction have sold for more than I think 3 or 4 thousand. One for 6,500. So hopefully, fingers crossed for the consigner, it'll go for maybe even more than that.
Oh, fantastic. And that's right. You don't really see images of Robert E. Lee in full uniform, right? That's very hard to come by.
It's certainly more common to see photos from life of him after the war, not in uniform. Now, even though he's in uniform in this CDV photograph, it likely was produced after the war, and I can tell that just by the imprint. Which, again, I apologize, I don't have access to it right now because the backing is still there. But I can tell from the imprint that it was likely produced maybe in the late 1860s or even the early 1870s. So maybe the photographer's firm had access to the original negative, and that's how the photo was produced. So somebody got their hands on this and likely sent it to the general. And again, he was very generous in signing things after the war. And they probably requested, "Do you mind signing this photo and sending it back?" And he was evidently complied with the request. Or maybe this person even encountered him in life and asked him to sign the photo while he was president of, what eventually became Washington and Lee University College. I think that he was besieged with people who were interested in obtaining his signature.
How do you go about that? Like, do you compare the signature to others signatures of known signed items? How do you do that?
Yeah, yeah, and at this point, a lot of it is almost intuition. I can look at that in a heartbeat, tell if it's genuine or not. You always want to do your due diligence and really kind of take it under a loop and make sure that all of its characteristics match up with a legitimate signature. But in this case, I mean, it's just flawlessly executed. All characteristics of the signature match with known signatures of Robert E. Lee. And there's a certain uh, kind of tonality to the ink, because the metal in the ink oxidizes after years and years and years. So everything about this is just perfectly fine.
I always wondered when it comes to signatures, when you look at it, if it's a little bit more sloppy, does that lean to its legitimacy? I wonder, because I know when I sign things, I just stop caring at some point,
Oh
So I always
yeah,
wondered,
absolutely.
you
And
know.
not every single signature matches previous signatures of that you can find, right? There is going to be some variance in the way that they sign their name. Just in the same way, like you just said, when you're signing your name over and over and over again on checks and different documents, if you were to compare all of them, you might see some significant differences, especially over the years. But somebody like Robert E. Lee would have signed thousands and thousands of documents and thousands of photographs. So after a period of time, there are just certain patterns that you can recognize that suggest legitimacy. And the same is true of Lincoln. That's another, and it's interesting too. Both Lee and Lincoln signed. They're not rare signatures. They signed thousands and thousands of documents. But because there's so much demand, the prices are often very competitive.
Well,
But
that's
anyway, but to your point, Lincoln's signature changed subtly over time, but maybe not as much as you might expect, and probably less than you or my signature has changed over the years.
right. There's probably more, they were probably more into penmanship back then too. I think, now that we type and
Yeah,
everything, people really not into their penmanship like that. So probably they
absolutely.
took a lot of pride in their
Over time in that
signature.
conversation,
Um,
someone's signature would have been a lot more important in 1865 than it is perhaps today. Because if you were trying to, if a bank was trying to confirm the authenticity of a document, it would be very important for someone's signature to be legible, perhaps, or maybe not legible, but it would have been important to be able to compare it to previous signatures to confirm authenticity. But anyway, okay. So the next item that I've plucked out, this is a 6th plate ambrotype of a Confederate soldier, and it originated from an estate sale in Tennessee. So you can sort of see it, maybe not so well here. It's a little bit
oh
darker,
wow, yeah, that's great.
but your audience will be able to see the scan of it. And the interesting thing about this portrait is that usually Confederate officers uh, look very aristocratic in their images. They're, especially the Virginians. I've noticed they like to sit there and sort of look the part of a Southern gentleman. Well, this guy wasn't having any of that. He was. I think that it originated from an estate in Tennessee, and I think that he likely is a Tennessee officer. And so he was in the Western theater of the war, and he just is completely decked out and ready to fight some Yankees. He's got his pistol and the rifle across his chest, an interesting pork pie hat, and he's, like I said, ready to fight.
No, that's definitely a great image. One question I have, especially with people who are coming in and just learning about collecting, how do you know when one image is a Confederate image or a Confederate guerrilla? I've heard, or or oh, it looks
Partisan.
like a farmer, but they say, oh, he could be a Confederate soldier. Or I've seen some, how do you know when it's truly a Confederate soldier?
Well, that's a fantastic question, because really, it can be very, very difficult. In this case, it's not so difficult because he's in Confederate regulation, in a Confederate regulation uniform. His collar has appropriate rank. He's got the what do you call them? The quatrefoil design on his sleeves. And it's a gray uniform, and the characteristics of the material are it's clearly like jean cloth, and a little bit thicker than what Union soldiers and officers were wearing. So in this case, it's pretty black and white. But as you alluded to, sometimes it can be very difficult. And I think we have a tendency sometimes as collectors and researchers to sort of say that someone might be a Confederate when really there's just the portrait lacks evidence that they were a Union soldier, right? So if they're not in a blue federally issued sack coat, then of course, and they're armed and clearly a soldier, then of course they must be Southern. Well, that's just not always the case. And so you have to lean on provenance, you have to lean on other evidence and contextual information in the image itself to try to make a determination.
Now, I do know that Confederate images tend to carry a premium just because they're a little bit more rare. I've talked
Absolutely.
to Ron Coddington about that, as he states, a lot of these images don't survive the test of time, sometimes. And also, too, there were less Confederates serving in the Civil War, right? So,
Mhm.
my question is, how much does something like this go for?
Well, I think the auction estimate will probably be 35 to $4,500 or in that ballpark. And it's interesting because if that were a Northern officer, it would probably be worth $500 to $700, something like that. So you can see there the price difference. And I just said the auction estimate will be for between 35 and $4,500. But I think that I anticipate it going for quite a bit more than that, um, especially now because the market is just red hot for collectibles across the board. But it should do very, very well. And as you said, that's probably due to a variety of different factors. There are less Confederate portraits in nice condition that exist, and I think there's higher demand and that there's more competition in the private market for Confederate and Southern portraits.
So my question to you is, well, I know you have the auction company, but how do you decide? Because I know you're friends with a lot of dealers, you know a lot of dealers, you know a lot of collectors. How do you decide, okay, this is an item that goes to auction, and this is an item I'm going to call somebody up and say, I know you want this. How do you make that decision?
Well, again, fantastic question, because as you can imagine, I have people calling me all the time who are interested in consigning items, and I kind of have to have a difficult conversation. Well, it's not always difficult, but you do have to be diplomatic in your explanation. And you might have to, or I do have to explain, listen, this basic portrait of a Union officer who's unarmed is fantastic, and many people would be very excited to have it. But you're not going to get any more money if I sell it at auction than you would if you sold it privately. And you're not going to get any more money through me than if you sold it on eBay. And so, really, an auction environment is best for exceptional items because, um, as I'm sure you're well aware of, and many people who are watching this are well aware of, when there's an environment where you have very aggressive buyers competing to obtain an item, you can end up with fantastic prices. And so, I guess that's what I'm trying to accomplish.
So one of my questions when it comes to consignment in an auction, right? If you purchase an item from an estate sale, could you
Mhm.
flip that item for more money in an auction possibly? Or is this something that, you know, you find in your attic and, it was owned maybe by your great great grandparents and then now you choose to sell it? As in, will you make money in an auction flipping an item, or is it something where it's just like if you have an item, you don't know really what you paid for it, you can get some money back for it, that sort of thing? I don't know if I'm making sense there, but like,
No,
can
no,
people
that
flip
that
items
makes
on auctions, or is it more just for people who have had an item for a long time, sort of like, I don't know, like Pawn Stars? Hey, I've been sitting in my attic for a long time, what's it worth? That sort of thing.
right.
um
Well, and you call to mind some, many different, I guess, circumstances on that I've seen on the Antiques Roadshow, where somebody says something like, "This was my great great grandfather's, but it's been sitting, in an attic for the last 50 years," and then the appraiser says it's worth $20,000 or something like that. And I guess to answer your question, it just depends, and I definitely have a mixture of people who consign items. I've had people who are left a lot of items when dad passes away, and the best way to sort of divvy up the funds if the heirs are not interested in keeping the items is to send it to an auction company, and then they can split up the proceeds. But I guess so. The answer to the first part of your question: can people flip items that they've purchased at an estate sale or on eBay or maybe even at a show? It happens all the time. And I guess the benefit of my company, because we're so specialized, and I've cultivated a clientele over the years that are interested in purchasing items relating to the Civil War specifically. I mean, it's such a niche um, hobby at the end of the day. I mean, we're just completely dwarfed by people who are interested in collecting sports collectibles or collecting art. I mean, we're just a tiny fraction of the collectibles market relative to the art market or sports collectibles. If you buy something at an estate sale, I think that if depending on the audience, you might be able to get it cheap and flip it through us and make quite a bit of money.
Fantastic. So anyone who's trying to get into selling their collection or have some items lying around, they'll definitely have to check out your website.
Yep.
What else do you have for us today?
Okay, so I think you're going to be excited about this. And I literally just opened the box. It was sent to us by the consigner. So this is a staff and field officer's sword that was presented to Colonel H.S. Putnam, who was colonel of the 7th New Hampshire Infantry during the Civil War. And the inscription on the hanger says, presented to Colonel H.S. Putnam, 7th New Hampshire Volunteers, October 1861. And so while many people watching this are probably not familiar with the name H.S. Putnam, which I think his first name was Haldimand or something unusual, they will be familiar with the Second Battle of Fort Wagner, which is where Colonel Putnam was heroically killed. He was shot in the head by a musket ball. And of course, the Second Battle of Fort Wagner was depicted in the film Glory, and it's where Robert Gould Shaw was killed and buried with soldiers in the 54th Massachusetts. And interestingly, Putnam is buried there as well. He was not sent back home. And that sword is like I said, a staff and field officer's sword, and it's just in excellent condition. The gold gilt, the wash on the guard and the hangers is almost entirely present. It's a high-grade sword. It has what's called an eagle's head quillion. It's literally like a cast eagle's head with ruby eyes. It was probably produced by a firm, even though it's not marked on the blade or anywhere else, by a firm called Klauberg in Germany and exported to the American market. So that's an exciting piece.
That is an amazing piece, a beautiful piece. Now, that is something that he probably would have, mounted on a wall at home, right? That was a gift. That's not something he's carrying in the field, right?
Very likely. I mean, actually, this isn't such a high quality sword that it would have been impractical. But judging from its condition now, I think it was very likely something that was sent home, or maybe it wasn't carried by him in the field. And I can say that with some certainty because he was killed in action. And so for him to have been killed and his body wasn't sent back home, he's buried somewhere probably close to the Gold Shaw and the soldiers of the 54th Mass, and close to his own soldiers who were killed in action as well. So the odds of him having carried that in battle and then it being sent home in that condition, I think it's very low. But it's still a superb piece, and it was actually presented to him at the beginning of the war once he got command of the 7th New Hampshire.
I was talking to an archaeologist about this, and I thought it was kind of funny how when archaeologists are digging or discovering items, how many times they look at an item and they go, what is this? I wish that this item just had, something written on it that said, this is what it is, this is what it was used for, this is who it belonged to. But there you have it. There you have a sword that literally says this was presented to, so-and-so of this regiment. And how rare is it to find something like that with that provenance right there on the scabbard?
Pretty rare. And while there are many staff and field officers' swords that still exist and have survived until today, very few were actually presented and still bear their inscription. So that's a rare piece, and it was probably treasured by his family and or friends for years and years and years. Oh, and I forgot to mention too, the blade itself is beautiful, and hopefully I'll be able to send you photos of this too. But the etching is still very strong. It's covered in patriotic motifs, and it actually bears the retailer Emerson and Silver, which was a company located in Trenton, New Jersey, and they were a large firm. So I believe that they were, and don't quote me on this, I'd have to look at it again. I believe they were the ones who likely etched the blade. So whereas I'm quite certain that this was produced by Klauberg in Germany and then exported, I think they were the ones who actually etched the blade itself, but it could have been Klauberg. Um, but I think that I can't tell you what lot that'll be in the sale yet, but the auction estimate will be something like $5,000 to $7,000, $68,000, and I think that we're crossing our fingers that it'll go for considerably more.
Oh, I bet. I bet. Now, just for people who might not know, I know you're describing the sword. There are different types of swords, different types of models of swords during the Civil War, right? How do you know that
Absolutely.
this is a field and staff?
So in this case, it's pretty evident because the guard has the letters US in it. And so I think that the lengths varied, even though it's a staff and field officer's sword. I don't know if it was longer or shorter than just a standard infantry officer's sword. But it's because of the guard itself. It has the initials US in the guard. In fact, I'll show it to you right there. And so that's how you can easily tell. It's also got shark skin or race skin grip, which is, of course, consistent with a sword of this quality. And it would have been fairly expensive at that time to buy for Colonel Putnam.
And that's in mint condition, pretty much. That's
It's pretty close. Like I said, the hangers and the guard itself, especially the guard, actually, um, I mean, almost 100% of the gold wash is present, and so I do believe that these are brass, but they have gold wash on them, and it's almost entirely here. Yeah, it's a fantastic sword, and so a lot of this was cast, but the more ornate embellishments, the stippling, and some of the patriotic motifs that you find on the hangers and the guard itself, those were hand done, and so this is a real artisanal product.
now I know that when we spoke before, you talked about one time you got bit by a sword one time, found out it was a fake.
I
And
think I still have it here.
yeah, and everyone has that moment, it sucks. But you when you described it, you said, you once you took that blade out of the scabbard, you knew that it was a fake. When you take this blade out of the scabbard on this sword, you knew this was legit. What are the things you look at that you say, okay, this is a legit sword, this is not, this is a reproduction sword?
It's probably easier for me to describe why I knew that the etching that was bad was in fact produced within the last 20 or 30 years. The You could just tell that it was like laser engraved instead of produced like they should have been during the Civil War era using some sort of acid or process to create the etching. And so the etching itself, because it was laser engraved, like it had no definition to it. It was just very flat. And when you rubbed your finger along it, it was just flush in a way that etchings that are actually legitimate are not. And so, um, unfortunately, at this point, a lot of it is just sort of second nature. I've handled so much original material that when I see something that's not in fact original, it's just apparent for a million reasons that I can't even describe. But in this case, I think that it's probably most apparent because another thing too, and this is I was once burned when I first started dealing by a sword that was not correct because like the ornate elements of the sword itself were just too there was no definition to it. It was too sloppy. And the makers of these things in the 1860s, they were um, craftsmen and they were extremely skilled. And so when something just looks like sloppy and crappy, it's a big red flag.
Well, I'm sure that piece is going to go for a pretty sum and to a very happy collector.
I
Uh,
hope so.
do you have anything else for us?
Let's see here. Okay, so this isn't going to make you fall over or anything, but I think it's a nice representative lot from the sale. This is a cavalryman, a Union cavalryman. It's a 6-plate tin type, I believe. And again, I apologize, it's sort of dark in here. But he is equipped with what looks like a Colt Army, maybe a Colt Navy, and his cavalry sword, and he's wearing a standard cavalryman's uniform. So I think that that'll be something that's more accessible to um, collectors who perhaps are not as advanced, and it's just a nice portrait to have in anyone's collection.
I think also cavalry pieces are pretty popular as well, right? I think
Oh,
people
absolutely.
love
There's a
cavalry.
whole yeah, there's a whole lot of collectors who are specifically interested in items relating to the cavalry.
But that's a great image. I think that's probably, like you said, probably most collectors will be um, have access to something that like that, right? Like how do you expect, how much do you expect that to go for?
The auction estimate will probably be $250 to $500 or so, and I think it probably will sell for around that amount, maybe a little bit more. And then the last piece that I picked out, where did I put it? Oh, right over here. Well, I guess I'll preface this this lot by saying that one thing that I'm particularly proud of since starting the company several years ago is that we really led the way when it comes to offering fantastic um, material relating to African American history during the Civil War. We've sold exceptional broadsides, we've sold exceptional documents to a number of different institutions and museums that are interested in exhibiting material and explaining to people who are visiting their museum or institution the legacy and the story of African Americans who lived during the Civil War era and during the antebellum era as well. So this is a bit of a horrific piece in many ways because it was the institution of slavery was horrific, but it's worth having in an auction and worth offering because it's important evidence. So with that note, one second. This is an original broadside that offered a reward for a runaway slave who ran away from or two runaway slaves who ran away from their master in Missouri. And so it offers a $400 reward for the arrest of two slaves, one named Ira, who's described as being 5'10", black complexed, or there's a complected, about 35 or 38 years old. And then another man named Silas, who is described as having a mustache and a bunch of whiskers on the chin, aged 28 years. And so I would imagine that the person who enslaved them is named here James W. Talbot, and he was located in Buchanan County, in Missouri. So it's a fantastic piece, and like I said before, horrific to contemplate, but important historically.
I'm surprised that you're able to even find something like that today.
It's amazing.
That's something that I mean, you would think that would never have survived the test of time. Would either been destroyed or thrown away. Like I don't see how that how something like that could have survived. It's very interesting.
It is amazing, and I do think that unlike many broadsides, this was actually used. And so many of the broadsides that have survived until 2022 were maybe kept by a courthouse as sort of record that something happened. When there's slave sale broadsides, they were kept by the courthouse as documentation. But in this case, I do think it was actually used. And how it survived this long, it's hard to say. And it's worth stating too that there was some conservation to the broadside, and it has been lined too, just for stability, and so that it'll survive hopefully for another 150 years.
Where did you find something like that?
That was previously sold at auction, I think about 4 or 5 years ago. And interestingly, rather recently, I was made aware of its provenance. So, a collector in Michigan who was interested in obtaining items relating to African American history, and I believe she was African American, started collecting in the 1930s or the 1940s. And I'm not sure where she came about this piece, but she had it and it was liquidated in her estate sale sometime in the early 2000s or maybe in the last 10 or 15 years.
I mean, can you even put a price on that? How much do you think that is going to be worth? That's something.
It's hard to say. It's really
Yeah.
hard to say. We haven't put an estimate on it yet, but it'll maybe be probably be over $10,000.
Wow. I mean, just looking at all these items, as you obviously deal in quality, these are amazing items and there's something for everybody. So
Right.
depending on what your interest is, or, if you're into Confederate images, if you're into Union images, if you're into swords, you've got it all, and you've got it at different prices for everybody. So it's amazing. I'm looking forward to this auction.
Hey, well, thank you so much, and I really appreciate what you do. And I think that I'm glad that you've started to collect for yourself too.
Well, thank you for coming on this show and sharing these items. And I'm definitely sure that a lot of my listeners will be excited to take part in this auction.